Hello guys, Crispy here, welcome back to another video. In this one, my friends, I'm gonna be testing a GeForce GTX 1660 Ti in Stalker 2 lag of Chornobyl. This one is the Zotac AMP edition of the card. I am running it with the latest Nvidia drivers and I'm not manually overclocking it. You can see all of its specs right here in Tech Power-Up's GPU-Z. And over on the left, I'm pairing it with the i5-12600K FCPU, overclocked to 5.1 GHz and 32 GB of DDR5. Let's get into it, shall we? And let's go over the settings first. I am starting at 1080p resolution, utilizing the high settings preset, which is pretty intensive, of course. FSR 3.1 is set to native AA, so it's still native resolution, just with the added anti-aliasing from FSR. FSR 3.1 Frame Generation, which is missing the Frame Generation name over there, is disabled at the moment, but we're also going to try it out, of course, and everything else is still on high. And well, guys, using the high settings preset, we're getting just below 30 frames per second here in this settlement area, which is very intensive, of course. Yeah, it's not a great experience. The frame time graph is a bit all over the place as well, with a lot of micro stuttering everywhere. A common thing amongst UE5 titles, actually. But at least it doesn't feel very stuttery here, I guess. But with these FPS, it's definitely completely unplayable, unfortunately, guys. To be expected on high settings in such an intensive game, honestly. So let's go ahead and try it with how it came with, actually. Instead of doing FSR Quality, which looks really bad in this game, actually, even though it's FSR 3.1, I'm gonna try TSR Ultra Quality with resolution scaling set to 75%. And once again, guys, this is how it came out of the box. I just started the game, it was set to Ultra Quality, TSR, and I was getting around these FPS here in the settlement area. So it's good for 30 plus frames per second, apparently, with these settings. But what I hate the most about TSR Ultra Quality here in this game, a lot of people do like it, and that's fine. You know, it definitely looks less aliased than with FSR native AA, actually, but there's a heck of a lot more blurriness and artifacting around things. Like, look at this little tree over here. It looks absolutely awful. There is tons of ghosting. It's terrible. I really hate it, actually. But if you want 30 plus frames per second on high settings and you don't mind that blurry look and artifacty look all over the place, yeah, these fields with a lot of vegetation get hit the hardest, actually, with TSR. It looks really bad, and the YouTube compression is gonna wreck everything, by the way. But yeah, trust me, this looks really bad, in my opinion. But notice that the frame time is quite a bit better than it was at native resolution, right? It's not stuttering as much, or micro stuttering as much at least, and it actually is providing a playable experience here with the 1660 Ti. VRAM allocation and usages are also fine. They went down by a little bit by using 75% resolution scale here, and on a native 1080p display, especially smaller displays, you know, like 24 inches, 22 inches, maybe 18 inches, those should actually look decent with 75% resolution scale. And this is still high settings, of course. We can lower this down to medium and low, although you usually don't get that many FPS in this game by lowering the presets, unfortunately, unless it's from epic to high. Now, I'm gonna try 100% resolution scaling here with TSR Ultra Quality as well, and that seems to be... oh boy! Okay, this is terrible. We need to restart. So it ran out of VRAM here at native resolution. That's what happened. I guess if you play the game for like 30 minutes plus and you don't restart, this will eventually happen. Okay, the FPS will drop into single digits because the game has a VRAM leak issue still, or a memory leak issue, actually. That's it. Yeah, okay, but we're back here after the restart, and we're now into the 20s, so TSR seems to be a little bit more intensive on native resolution compared to FSR, and it's still a bit blurrier than FSR, even at native res. So I'm gonna do FSR 3.1 on quality next. I'm gonna apply that. And here we go, it applied successfully. The frame gen is still disabled, and we're getting 40s now. Now, this is 67% resolution scale. It's not 75% resolution scale like we tested with TSR Ultra Quality. So things are definitely a lot more shimmery, guys. Like the vegetation is really, really shimmery. But it's a double-edged sword, right? Like, at least you get a little bit more clarity from your game with FSR Quality, but it's more pixelated at the same time. But at least it doesn't have as much ghosting as TSR did. And XeSS also has a ton of ghosting in this title, by the way, which I really, really hate. So, what's best here? I feel like 67% resolution scaling at 1080p is a bit too low, guys, because you're upscaling from 720p all the way up to 1080p, and the starting resolution is just way too low. You know, the internal resolution of 720p, it's pretty terrible. So it's a shimmery mess basically right now. I don't like it, but once again, on a small display, it might look fine. It's down to personal preference then, basically. It also gives you a bit more FPS than 75% resolution scale with TSR, and if you drop TSR further from 75%, it's going to look absolutely terrible because it was already pretty rough. By the way, the i5 is doing a really fine job. Actually, the performance of this i5 at 5.1 gigahertz, when not GPU bound, because we're always GPU bound here with 1660 Ti, of course, is not too far off of my 7800X3D. So this game doesn't really utilize X3D CPUs all that well, unfortunately. And that's also why my test with the Ultra 9 185H coupled, that's a mobile CPU, coupled with a 4070 Ti Super Desktop GPU was giving us like 50-60 frames per second here still. It was quite incredible, actually. I couldn't believe it after testing the game a lot with the 7800X3D, which is one of the best gaming CPUs in the market, of course, and it was only capable of 70-ish, 80 FPS around there in the settlement area with some drops into the 60s in the most recent patches as well. Anyway, this is it, guys. It's playable once again if you don't mind using FSR or any other form of upscaling. It's going to deliver a decent experience with 40-ish frames per second. 1% lows are at 28, but it never really dropped that far. It's just because of the inconsistent frame time graph. But let's go back to native AA over here, which, interestingly, with FSR doesn't really put us in single digits, but I want to check it out with some FSR 3.1. Remember that we were seeing drops into the 20s with FSR native AA without FSR 3. Well, the frame generation, you know, and now we should be seeing close to 2 times the frame rate here, although it's only perceived smoothness because the actual playability of the game went down now, in my opinion. Like, there is a heck of a lot of input lag, guys. You can somewhat mitigate this by enabling reflex over here. Okay, I'm just enabling Nvidia reflex, and the input lag gets slightly better, and we still get it around the same FPS, but no. We're using FG with a baseline FPS of 30 frames per second, basically, or 20 sometimes, especially there in the settlement area, and that means that the input lag is tremendously high, guys. It's just completely awful of an experience, and I would never recommend this to anyone. And that's actually an interesting segue to the RTX 50 series with the multi-frame generation. If the input lag of multi-frame generation is around the same as it is here with the normal frame generation, and granted the Nvidia frame generation is a little bit less input laggy than the AMD's frame generation here with FSR 3.1, okay, so it's slightly better feeling, I guess. But yeah, they were using like path tracing on the 5090 in Cyberpunk, I believe, with 28 frames per second baseline, you know, and then adding multi-frame generation over it and getting hundreds of FPS. I mean, how is the input lag going to be on that? I'm very curious to see it, and I can't wait to check it out, actually. But yeah, over here with a baseline of 30, it just feels terrible. It also has some bigger spikes in the frame time graph here and there, you know, some more noticeable stutters, and it just doesn't feel good whatsoever. Now, what about quality FSR plus frame generation? Is it going to be a lot better? Because we were seeing 30 plus consistently and up into the 40s sometimes. Well, in terms of input lag, it's definitely a bit better than it was before, because now the baseline again is 30 to 40, not 20 to 30. But it still feels really bad in terms of input lag, guys. And of course, now we added a layer of softness over what we saw with Quality FSR. So Quality FSR was already pretty rough in the edges, quite literally, okay? But now FG somewhat smooths that out, but it's still running at a 720p resolution and being upscaled to 1080p. That's not a lot of resolution to work with, and it looks really bad, basically. I wish the implementation of FSR in this game was better, actually. But hey, you're seeing the results, 60 plus FPS, basically, with high settings, sometimes dropping into the 50s. Yeah, again, you might think it's good, but in my opinion, it is pretty terrible, guys, and it's not enjoyable whatsoever, okay? So I'm gonna go back to native resolution, and we're gonna play on medium settings this time around. I'm gonna apply that, and I'm gonna restart the game to fully apply things. And well, here we have it, 1080p resolution using medium settings preset, native AA. I could do like optimized benchmarking settings, for example, and I have tried it in the past in a video here in the channel, but it doesn't really give you that many FPS more than high settings. It's somewhere in between medium and high, and medium and high is what, 10% apart, so yeah, I'm sticking to presets here in this game instead of using like optimized settings, because again, it looks pretty much the same. All of them look pretty much the same. The biggest difference between medium to high that I have noticed here is the shadow render distance. Like, look at that shadow. It's really terrible looking. Like, I have tested Far Cry 4 last week on a GTX 690, and that game looked really good for its age. It's 11 years old, guys. In some ways, the games these days are looking a little bit worse. Obviously, overall, the presentation is better in today's games, but in terms of blurriness, ghosting, motion blur, in terms of artifacting, shimmering, stuttering as well, VRAM consumption, comparing the textures, obviously they look a lot better in today's games, but not 10 times better to justify 10 times higher VRAM usage or something like that, like 5 times. It's a shame. Like, it's clear that today's games are less optimized. They do look better, obviously. I'm not saying that they don't, but I wish we had some optimization from the early 2010s. Anyway, that's definitely off topic. Go watch that Far Cry 4 video if you want to refresh your memory on how games used to look like and run like. Obviously now we have all of these software ray tracings and so on, and hardware ray tracings as well with other GPUs, which are very intensive, and obviously those older GPUs can't even run those things. So I understand why new games don't launch on ancient GPUs. It's just that if they were a bit better optimized, if they used older engines as well, like UE4 instead of UE5, it could have looked 80% as good or 90% as good, and it would have run on old GPUs, new GPUs, high refresh rates, but no, we're stuck with this now. But anyway, it still drops into the 20s, as you can see sometimes, especially when arriving at settlements, which is extremely intensive, and it always drops your FPS, even on high-end systems. But yeah, most of the time, it stays above 30 frames per second. Now, if we enable frame generation on top of this, and I'm also going to enable the reflex here, it's the same story as before. Since we didn't get a good bump in FPS coming from high to medium settings, the frame generation is still working with a baseline of 30-ish frames per second, and it feels terrible. It still drops into the 50s here. It's micro-stuttering quite a lot now, but it could be playable with a controller. I have actually tested this with the Radeon 780M integrated graphics. It was completely terrible and awful of an experience, of course, without a controller, with mouse and keyboard, which is how I'm playing right now, and you can feel a lot of that input lag and stuff like that, and especially if you need to shoot at enemies, it's going to be hard to micro-adjust the aiming with this amount of input lag, basically, and snap from one enemy to another and so on. It's really bad, okay? But the thing is, with the controller, it actually is kind of doable because you can feel the input lag less, and I was very surprised to see that I could actually live with this amount of input lag with the controller, but with mouse and keyboard it's absolutely terrible. Anyway, that's it for medium settings, right? I could also try quality FSR once again, which looks pretty bad. And no frame generation, no reflex. By the way, if you don't disable reflex after you disable frame generation, the game won't fully utilize your GPU, so that's... I don't like that, of course. But yeah, with FSR quality, it's not too much better. Instead of low 30s, we're seeing 40s, high 30s. It's a little bit more stable, once again, definitely. 40s feel a lot better than 30s, obviously. But it's not completely game-changing, and I'm not sure if the shimmery edges and all the noise that FSR introduces are worth taking for 10 FPS, roughly, or 8 FPS, something like that. Let's check out, like, XeSS, actually, this time around. Oh, boy. So I'm gonna do ultra-quality XeSS, which is 66% resolution scale, apparently. I thought it was 75, but they named the Ultra Quality Plus 75% resolution scale, 76. Anyway, again, a lot of people like XeSS better than FSR. I feel like it has more ghosting, it's softer looking, and you can't see 10 meters away from you because everything is just loses all of the detail, you know? In other games, that's true. XeSS does look better than FSR most of the time. But in this one, I don't think so. It flickers as well. I'm seeing a lot of flickering issues here with XeSS, and I've noticed that as well with other videos and other GPUs testing this technology. It's not worth it, in my opinion. A lot of people will say otherwise, and if you can't notice all of the imperfections and the issues with the image quality here with XeSS, and if you like the way it anti-aliases, go ahead, use whatever you want. Obviously, the best one would be DLSS, but we don't really have that on the GTX 1660 Ti, which is a bit of a shame. Oh boy, so much aliasing. This is the worst aliasing that I've seen so far. Okay, and that's because, no, we are actually at native resolution, guys. This is native 1080p. I'm glad that it allows us to disable TAA, but this is the end result. And once again, Far Cry 4 from 2014 does native resolution better than this game does. It's kind of crazy. And that's it for medium settings, guys. Let's try out the low settings preset here next. Light shafts are still enabled. I'm gonna keep them enabled. They don't impact your FPS, okay? And I'm not gonna do none here. I prefer to use native AA under FSR 3.1, honestly. Because at least it's still shimmery, of course, but it gives you anti-aliasing. And here we have it, guys. Low settings. It gives us what? 5 more FPS or something like that compared to medium settings. Not even 5 sometimes. And now we got a lot more pop-in. Like you can see everything popping in. Like look at the trees at the distance. They're popping out actually sometimes. That's really weird. Maybe it's because of the anomaly over there. But yeah, there's a lot more pop-in here on low settings compared to medium settings. There's the shadow pop-in as well. It's even worse now. The render distance is lower on low settings. Pretty much everything is lower quality, of course. The one thing that still looks really, really good is the texture quality. Even on low settings, textures still look really good for the most part in this game. They took a while to load here, but still. Like, yeah, these are some very nice and high-quality textures for a low settings preset, in my opinion, but it is a shame that it's still getting us 30 to 40 FPS. So we went from 28 or something like that, 27 sometimes on high settings and touching 30 FPS sometimes here as well, to having what, a minimum of 33 FPS or something like that. That's another problem with today's games, guys. We don't see a lot of scaling between settings, you know. And in terms of graphics, well, it still looks extremely good for low settings preset, aside from all of those pop-in issues, of course. But I think if you can deal with that, it's still going to be a playable and a nice-looking experience, right? But I also feel like we should have had a lot higher performance coming from high to low settings. And maybe we should have had a very low settings preset for older GPUs, like a 1660 Ti. is getting a bit old at this point. It released back in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, or 2019, and obviously the RTX stuff was already a thing back then. This was slower, a little bit slower than the RTX 2060, which was the entry level on the RTX series, in the 20 series, okay? So it wasn't super high-end or anything like that. It also matched the performance of the 1070 or the 980 Ti, you know, that came before it. But it's not a bad GPU. Once again, like, it still cost $270 back then, and you might think, yeah, that's very low these days, because we have seen some price increases in the recent years, some crazy price increases as well, and now the sub $300 GPU market is completely dead, aside from the B580, which I haven't tested yet because it's not available here yet for some reason, even after a month of it being out. Come on, there we go. Killed all of these bobsters. Let's get out of here now. But yeah, that's to say that a 1660 Ti is not bad by any means. It was my main GPU once upon a time, actually, and I even played games at 1440p with it. I believe my full review of it was actually made at 1440p mainly, and it did an absolutely fine job at 1440 medium settings. So seeing it do 40s on low settings at 1080p, it just doesn't sit right with me. But anyway, let's enable frame gen over native AA here at 1080p low settings. Actually, I forgot to enable the reflex over here. Let's do that. And we're getting 70s, 80s. It touches 80 FPS more often than previously on medium or high settings with FG, but it's still kind of the same, 70s to 80s most of the time, and in the settlement area, it's still going to drop into the 60s. We're quite far away from it, so I'm just going to load the game. Here we go, 60s, already dropping into the 50s still, just like we've seen on medium settings. So again, a lot of people like FG, but I feel like with a 30 to 40 FPS baseline, it doesn't feel good whatsoever, and I don't think it's viable to utilize on these GPUs, unfortunately, with these frame rates. And that's a big shame, because if we had a baseline of 60 FPS at 1080p low settings, we'd be getting 100 FPS with FG, or 120 sometimes, and that would actually feel quite a lot smoother while not having a lot of input lag. But as it stands, we do have a lot of input lag. It does feel smoother still, but it's crap, basically. I don't like it. So that's been it, guys, for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have a 1660 Ti and you've been wanting to buy this game, well, now you know how it runs, you know my opinions on it. It is playable. It's not super enjoyable. I think I would stick to older titles, honestly. But yeah, let me know your opinions. Let me know if you have been playing this game on the 1660 Ti or the 1660 Super, which is 5% slower, so it's going to be basically the same thing here. And I'll catch you in the next one very soon. As always, love you all. Bye-bye.